All right, AMD marketing department. If you are out there, we have got to talk. Get in touch with Johnny Rage. You need to hire me because I tell you what, you guys are selling yourself short. Let me just fix these slides for you. As long as Intel gamers are staring at blue screens, you are infinitely faster. Gaming performance, infinitely faster. Productivity, infinitely faster. If we're going to put some big numbers up here, let's put some big numbers up here and just ride out the downfall as Intel as all those fanboys are staring at blue screens. Am I right? But in all seriousness, I don't know where they come up with these numbers, but this is going to be Johnny Rage's real review of the 9600X. So we're going to go over a couple of things today. First up, obviously, the specs. We're going to go over the specs, kind of some of the hype, new capabilities of this processor, where it falls out, performance-wise, value-wise, and then, my final thoughts and kind of how I think about it, all joking aside. So really what we look at, 9600 versus 7600, is they're using a new node, so it's the process size is 4 nanometers versus 5, so it's a little bit thinner. What that means is you can get more transistors into a smaller die size. So there you go, you got the specs on the screen. And then launch price came down about 20 bucks, but I don't really think that's real because it's a 65 watt CPU and they didn't give you a cooler. And it's a slightly smaller die. I mean, I guess they're about the same size die, but whatever. It's 20 bucks, that's cool, I guess. And then they're boasting some increased RAM capabilities, so the 56 versus 52. We're always going to use Expo or XMP anyways for the overclock on the RAM, but that base rate coming up shows you maybe we got some more capability there, which we'll talk about. And then the frequency, because it's 65 watt versus the 105 TDP for the old one, the base frequency is lower, but the boost is a little bit higher. Usually on these Ryzen CPUs, 100 megahertz does almost nothing for you. But we are just looking around more overall efficient CPU. So that 100 megahertz, sure, it's nice, but I think we're just going for efficiencies and IPC uplift, like they proposed that would be 16%. So, and then the PPT total power there, 88 watts versus 142, and those are pretty dang accurate. All these specs are off a Tech Power Up, so you can go to that website. I'll have a link for it down below, and you can review the actual specs in more detail, or they got links to other reviews, things like that, if you want to learn more about it. But that's kind of where we're at. It's a little bit of a new process node that's a little thinner, a little more efficient, and it's got some upgrades to it. So before we get into it, we got to look at the competition. All this data was pulled up off Tech Power Up as well, which I will have the links down below. But the way I look at it is I have all the low-range competitors here, and then I have the 7800X 3D, because I think there's a break point. If you're looking specifically at gaming, you either just need the cheapest CPU, because any of the AM5s are absolutely pretty stellar for gaming, or you get to that break point where you need the 7800X 3D. And I personally would put that probably somewhere around, the 4070 Ti Super for NVIDIA, or the 7900 XT for AMD. That's kind of the break point of where we need to get into the 7800. And I wanted it on there just to see, like, hey, if we do spend the big bucks, how much are we really gaining? All the specs are here, but what I really want to look at is this gets into the value conversation, which I don't think this is a big surprise. A lot of reviews are already out on this thing. I don't have early access, so I just bought it on launch day. I got it 2 days later, and I'm getting the review out. But a lot of people have already said it's not a great value today, but we're going to cover more than that. But just so you get the idea of the numbers, a rough guesstimate from Tech Power Up is the 7600X is 96% as fast, and it's only 70% of the cost. And then I've been a huge supporter of the 7500F. It's not popular in the US because you can't buy it at all your big retailers. They don't have it at Amazon or anything like that. It's an OEM only. And I'm non-monetized, so I don't like sticking my neck out for anybody because I don't get a kickback. But I've ordered a bunch of these off AliExpress, and they're 129 bucks. And don't That's not from Tech Power Up. That's why I put an estimate there. But I'd estimate it's about 94% as fast. If you do PBO, you can look up the benchmarks. It's about a 7600, and it's only 46% of the cost. So you're looking at half the cost, and I bet it's within 10% of the new 9600. So if you're trying to get into AM5 and you want the DDR5, that's the thing you want to look at, in my opinion, because it's going to save you a significant amount of money that you can start putting towards your GPU. But I don't want to turn this into totally comparison video. I want to keep this on track with the 9600X and looking at its capabilities. But I do just want to put up there because we're going to have the conversation of value, and that's kind of the competition and where it's at. The other thing, last on this, is the 7800X3D Tech Power Up. This is in their 1080p gaming. I don't know how they only calculated it 8.5% faster and 32% more money, but that's me running the math on the money on the right column, but I found it to be a lot faster, and we'll get into that here in a minute. So the rig that I'm using today, it's going to be rocking the ASROCK B650E PG Riptide. And when we get into overclocking and talking about Infinity Fabric speeds and some of this other stuff, I just want to point out this is not a insane motherboard. I think I paid like 160 bucks for it. It is not some like MSI God mode or whatever that stuff's called that's like $1,200. It's nothing like that. Like, we were able to get some pretty impressive OC settings on a relatively inexpensive board. Next thing up that's massively overkill for both these processors that I got in here is the Arctic Freezer 3. Can't recommend this thing enough. I have the 420 because I have a massive case, and my temps were like 47 to 50 degrees in pretty much all gaming benchmarks, and any sort of like actual stress test, it never got above 70, which is absolutely unreal. But that cooler is definitely overkill for pretty much everything. Then I got my G-Skill DDR5 6000 CL30. I think everybody knows that's like the standard these days. And then new to this testing suite, I have recently picked up an MSI RTX 4090 Supreme Liquid X, which I love that card. But that's the rig that we're going to be looking at today. And the number one thing that I was pumped about when they announced this processor was the new OC capability, so overclock. And they promised that it would have better RAM compatibility, better speeds on the memory, and have a new curve shaper option. And this is my favorite part about this processor, but it's also not. So I'm going to be digging into this way more. I'm going to have a separate overclock video coming out on this. So if you subscribe down below, you'll be notified when that comes out. But I'm kind of a double-edged sword. Like, I was super pumped when I was in there, just in the BIOS. I was like, oh my god, it's amazing. Like, I'm the best overclocker. I'm so smart. Johnny Rage is going to have the fastest 9600X. He's going to prove them all wrong. It's going to be so freaking fast. The 1% difference. Yeah, right, dude. I'm going to have like so much performance. It's unreal. That's what I felt when I was putting the settings in. And then I did the benchmarks, and I wasn't that good. But I do want to talk about this, the Infinity Fabric speed. So on the 7000 series, it was very hard, and it was kind of considered like you had a golden chip if you could get it to 2200 megahertz. Most people could get it stable at about 2167, and a lot of people would have to change different voltages, things like that, to get it there. I did all this testing in one night because I was trying to get this out, because I already knew I had a 2-day delay because I had to order it and get it shipped on launch day. But I just went in there, changed nothing, set the F clock to 2200 megahertz, and the system ran great. Then set the U clock to MIM clock equal, and then I used the same G-Skill kit that I've been using for probably a year and a half now. And on my overclock run, I clocked it at 6400 megahertz because AMD says that should be the new sweet spot, even though I've heard mixed things on that. And I was able to keep it at CL30. So most of the 6400 kits will be at CL32. Manually tuning it, I was able to get it 6400 CL30. And the only thing that was required was I took the voltage from 1.35 to 1.4. I ran a stress test on it to make sure it was stable, and even on the stress test, it was sitting at like 39 degrees, absolutely acceptable, and it was good to go. The next setting, Fmax. So on PBO, you're not doing an actual, I keep saying overclock. you're not doing like an actual overclock in the sense of like you're setting a higher frequency. You're basically changing the rules of which the processor operates in, and you're doing that in order to enable a higher clock over time than you would normally see. So the Fmax, you're not actually increasing the megahertz by 200, but you're making the ceiling higher by 200. So this is a 5.4 gigahertz turbo boost, and with that plus 200, it would stay stable at 5,640 megahertz basically, and it would just sit there. And then the way that you do that is if you set the Fmax higher, but you don't change anything else, it might hit it, it might not, depending on your cooling solution. But then you go in with the curve optimizer and you set up the curve optimizer. So on the 7000 series, all you had was the curve optimizer, negative or positive, and you could set it in increments of 5, and you could do it per core or all core. Now we've got the curve shaper. So the curve shaper basically, as of the BIOS right now, it just has like a ton of lines, like this particular situation, this situation, this situation, this situation. At least on my board, I've heard a lot of the manufacturers are coming out with like a graphical user interface, so you can really get this thing dialed in. My ASROCK did not have that at time of launch. I am very excited for Curve Shaper once the higher end CPUs come out. I think on like the 9950X and those that are really pulling some power and have a ton of cores, it will be a great feature. I think it'll be huge. On this processor, it was absolutely not worth my time because I was able to immediately just set all core negative 35, and throughout every benchmark and to this moment now, I've had 0 crashes. And I have ran a few stability tests. I haven't had a chance because I was doing this all in one night. I haven't had a chance to run like a 24-hour stability test, but I've had 0 crashes, and I've ran a couple hours worth of stability testing, and I've had 0 errors. So at least initially enough to get gaming, this thing is stable. I'd have to do more testing to be like, absolutely, this is it. But with the all-core negative 35, the CPU was able to run the 5640 megahertz. It pulled 88 to, I think on one game, it went to a maximum of like 104 total package power watts. And then it sat usually about 47 to 50 degrees in gaming. And I think I saw it get up to like 70 once when I was doing an actual CPU stress test. So once again, my cooler is overkill, but I was able to get, that additional 200 megahertz, keep it cool, and it was still running like 1.2 volts or something like that. So as far as efficiency and this overclocking goes, I was thinking this is going to be amazing, but let's get into the results and see how it went. So this slide is terrible, I know, but here's the deal, guys. Like half my job is working in Excel and PowerPoint, and I hate them, and I'm no good at them, and I can't believe I don't get fired from my day job. But I'm a one-man show, and this is basically my numbers. It looks terrible. It's a eyesore. So just focus on me, and I'll walk you through what's important. So what I have here on the left is just the 9600 with Expo only. So that's default settings with just the RAM tuned to the 6000 CL30. Then I have my overclock, which is what we just talked about. I basically upped the Fmax by 200, did the curve optimizer, and then set the Infinity Fabric speed to 2200, and then uclock, memclock equal. And then on the right, I have my 7800 X3D. So we're talking about, hey, how much did we really leave on the table? And then overall, all these are at 1080p, and I'm utilizing that RTX 4090. So this is purely a CPU benchmark. I would not expect most people to game this way. So even if you stepped it up to 1440, these margins would shrink. 4K, they would shrink. And then realistically, who's going to buy a 9600 to go with a 4090? If you have something like a 4070, you probably be under constant GPU bottleneck, and the scores would be identical. We're forcing a CPU bottleneck so we can see, hey, really how much difference here is there. And the first thing I'll talk about is that OC, the new PBO settings and everything. I guess I should refer to it as PPO because it's not like a traditional overclock. I mean, I'm effectively changing what clocks I'm getting, but yeah, yada, 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 whatever. Don't want to waste time on that. I marked in red and green here. Looks like a damn Christmas tree. But right out of the gate, I ran Counter Strike and I picked up like 40 to 50 frames per second. And I was like, oh yeah, I'm killing it. Everybody else said they only gained like 1%. I'm gaining 7% right out of the gate. I'm slaying. And then the second thing I did was I ran Cyberpunk and I lost 7%. So this was very interesting to me because I've never seen a 7000 series CPU lose performance with PBO settings on anything unless there's stability problems. So I was immediately like, oh no, my system's probably not stable. I started running way more tests, couldn't get the thing to crash. I don't know what's going on there. Like I said, I'm going to spend the next week and do some much more thorough digging on tweaking the overclock and PBO and all that good stuff. But it seems like the system is stable, but that was very curious to me that right out the gate I saw a 7% uplift and then saw 7% fallback. Forza, uh, probably margin of error on the average, but then the right column's 1% low, huge gain. And you see in some of these titles, the extra frequency was huge for the 1% lows. And when this poor little 6-core CPU is trying to power a 4090, excuse me, at 1080p, it is having a hell of a time. So it doesn't shock me that sometimes the 1% lows drop out. So what you can see here is ultimately my PBO settings only net me 2.5% on my average, but 5.5% on my 1% lows. So free performance. If I keep this CPU, I will definitely be running it, and I am going to keep it for quite a while, and I'm going to continue, like I said, to try to tweak it to try to get rid of those negatives. Because if I got rid of those negatives, that would be a huge gain on performance. And most of the other initial reviews I saw only picked up like 1%. I think they probably just enabled PBO and that's it. When you do that, it gets rid of some of the power limitations. But if you're not doing the curve optimizer, you're not going to see that pickup. And if you're not doing the Fmax and all that, because you're telling it basically for a given voltage to run a higher frequency, and unless you just have the worst bend product ever, you can usually do that pretty easily. I've never seen a Ryzen processor that can't run some amount of negative curve optimizer. And as long as you keep it cool, it's going to keep boosting, and that's more performance. But all right, so moving over to the right, so what do we miss out on if we don't buy a 7800 X3D? Because we know it's the best for gaming. Most likely when the 9950X comes out even, it'll probably still be the best for gaming. It's not going to be challenged till the new X3D processors come out. So in reality, you're losing 15% on the average, 30% on the 1% lows. And this is where people just really underestimate the X3D processors, is that 1% low. And I've done benchmark after benchmark, and I've pointed this out multiple times. The 1% low difference is massive. 30% is it's going to get rid of all those micro stutters, all the weird jitters. It's going to be stuff like, it's not like when your GPU lags and everything just constantly looks like trash, but those 1% lows can catch you at the worst possible moment, and you almost might not even consciously see it, but it'll be that split second lag in the middle of a match or something. So I'm huge into that. And that's really the power of the X3D processor. So as you see, they're only like 15% on average, but almost 30% in the 1% lows. And then once you overclock, so this final column over on the far, whatever side that is, far other side of the screen, it makes up a little bit of room, but you're still 12% on average, 22% on the 1% lows. So obviously, the 7800 X3D significantly faster, but it's also 30% more expensive. So if you look from a value perspective, even in this most constrained setting, people will say the 9600X is a bad value, and it is because of the competitors, the 7600 and all that, but it's still not really that bad of a value compared to the 7800 X3D, because it's $360 and this processor's $280, which is about a 32% difference, I think we said earlier. So value-wise, not looking that bad compared to the 7800 X3D. So with that, we talked about the new overclocking features. We looked at its real life performance, and we talked about, some of the pros and cons of its competitors. And this is my main takeaway. I love the AM5 platform, and I think that once again, like AMD always does, expectations were set very, very high. And so this is in no way an exciting product. It's not. People wanted to plug it in and see 16% more FPS. I don't think that was ever going to happen because almost everyone is GPU limited anyway. So if you set your system up right, you always want to have a little CPU overhead. So you were never going to see 16% more FPS. But when people saw that 16% more IPC, that's just what it translates to in your brain. It's human nature. That was never going to happen. It's not an exciting product because it's not extremely faster. It's not way cheaper. In fact, it's more expensive. And currently, today, it's not a good value. You will get, 95% of the performance at a last gen now for 70% of the cost. So you got almost the exact same product. But I do think it's a good product. And I think this is going to age well with time because you only have to think back a little while to remember when the 7600X came out, it was $300, and people were thinking, who would pay $300 for a 6-core processor? I'm going to stick with AM4. And to this day, people still scream like AM4, AM4, never let it die. AMD still putting out new AM4 processors. So I think it's a good product because I know that other reviewers had some problems with it, but right out of the box, I ordered one on launch day. I got it 2 days later, updated my BIOS, installed it, immediately it ran. I was immediately able to get in, change all the PBO settings. I was able to get much more aggressive settings than last gen would have let me without an extreme amount of tuning time. And I still have a long ways to go on my current tune, but I was able to right out of the gate prove that it's going to be capable of more than last gen. And then the bigger thing is just the energy efficiency. And everybody's been hitting on this. And this is less of a product and more of, I guess, like a philosophy or outlook on life as a civilization or something. So we're going to get real deep here, real quick. But, the way technology is going, everybody wants more, more, more. It's getting to the point, especially with this AI boom. I hate that I even said that word. But, they're talking about like, oh, it's going to take a nuclear reactor to power, one of these AI data centers. Like, just one data center because the amount of power that they're mathematically calculating will be required to power the amount of NVIDIA GPUs people are just stacking on top of each other. So this is a way sidebar, but if you're telling me you're going to get more performance and it's going to use significantly less energy, make less heat, that's efficiency. But the thing is, efficiency isn't exciting. Nobody wants to go do their water cooler talk and be like, you cannot believe the processor I got. It's 20% more efficient. That's the equivalent of going to tell your buddy who just bought a Challenger that your Prius is so cool. People have been failing at that since the early 2000s. Nobody likes your Prius. I'm sorry. So it's not an exciting launch, but I think it's a good product. It does more with less. It runs cooler. It takes less energy. It's not an exciting amount faster, but it is faster. And it gives you that overhead with some additional overclocking tools to really push it to the limit. And I'll be interested to see. I think that will be much more exciting with the higher end chips. I don't think the 9600 is really set up to really utilize all those options. I think on the high end chips, it's going to get really cool when we start looking at dual CCDs with 8,000 megahertz RAM, and we start looking at, being able to really do the curve shaper and all that good stuff. So I'm still staying positive overall for the generation. I think it's just going to age well, in 6 months to a year, when this processor is $196, we're going to be thankful that it exists and we're not still buying 7600s from, you know, 3 years ago at that point that are just burning through electricity for nothing. So That's kind of my stance. I think it's a good product. I think it's an unexciting product, which is its biggest problem. But I do got two bonus rounds that I think are scummy. I think Daniel Owen brought it up. Is he was like, did they really give us a break? Because they called it the 9600X, but it's a 65-watt processor and they didn't include a cooler. So they cut the price $20, but they took the cooler out. I think that is kind of scummy because even with PBO on, this thing runs like the 88 watts that it's advertised at, different than the TDP, the actual PPT. And the whole point of not including a cooler on the high wattage versions is that they know people are going to push it to the limit and it's going to need a aftermarket solution for cooling. This processor does not. So just include the cooler. Maybe they ran the math and they figured, X amount of people throw it out anyway and it just creates e-waste. I think they would have done way better if it would have been 289 with the cooler, maybe 269 without the cooler. That probably would have made it a little bit more exciting because right now that's their biggest problem is it's just not an exciting launch for this new entry level processor. And then the other thing that I think is kind of scummy is I just talked about, and a lot of people talked about how the energy efficiency is so exciting, but I feel like that's really just them watching Intel and now putting the responsibility on the user because Intel just went through a whole situation where they just kept pushing processors to the limit, pushing processors to the limit, and now they're all getting degradation and failing, and people are losing brand confidence, and they're having tons of warranty and RMA issues, and who's getting products replaced, and all this nightmare. It's a nightmare. No company wants to deal with that. I think that AMD went extremely conservative on this processor because how efficient it is, and then gave you all these overclocking tools to push it to the limit. But technically, if you use those tools, I believe I'd have to go read the fine print, but I believe it's been stated that you're technically voiding your warranty. So they're going extremely conservative and then being like, hey, do with it as you will, but it's kind of like on you at that point, which there's so much headroom on this processor that I feel like they could have given you a little more oomph without putting you in that position. I mean, with me maxing out the PBO, it's running at 5.65 basically gigahertz, and it's sitting at like 1.2 volts and like 47 degrees Celsius. Like we could we could push so much more through this processor with the right PBO settings. But they don't want to let you do that. And it would look silly if there was like a 6 gigahertz 6 core processor running like 200 watts out of AMD. People would be like, "What the hell are you doing?" Consumers would be confused. They'd be like, "I don't know. Do I get the 6 gigahertz processor? Do I get the X3D? I don't know what to do." Um, it would be a silly situation. But I think there's a little bit better of a balance available there. So that's what I've got on it today. Not exciting, but I think it's a solid product and it'll age very well into the future. And if you like the video, go ahead and give me a subscribe, and I'll catch you on the next one. Hopefully, pretty soon here, I got my better overclocked results, and I'll kind of talk to those in the next video.